This is the Read to Lead podcast, episode 553.
I've become increasingly obsessed with organizing my notes. So having gone from a very linear, very haphazard style when I was starting to write the notebook to, by the end of it, being pretty organized with my notes, now I am horrifically organized with them.
The notebook has shaped our thoughts for 800 years. In an age of AI and digital overload, the simple act of moving a pen across a blank page can boost our creativity and mood and continues to transform our ideas. Hi, I'm Jeff, and this is the Read to Lead podcast, the podcast dedicated to your personal and professional growth, where I believe that if you want to achieve true success in business and in life, then intentional and consistent reading is your best first step. Today's episode is literally a year in the making. I've known about this book for 15 months. I've had it in my hands for nearly that long, and I've been waiting all this time to bring it to you, and today, that day is finally here. I'm talking about the new book from Roland. It's called The Notebook, A History of Thinking on Paper. I'll be asking Roland to share about how commonplace books have shaped personal learning and intellectual engagement, what aspects of your notebook entries can provide insights into your personality or cognitive patterns, how notebooks function as an extension of the mind, and lots more. While we're on the subject of notebooks and note-taking, I want to talk about my course, Note-Making Mastery. It's been offered live a number of times, but it's on sale this week only as a self-paced version as part of my Black Friday deal this year. You can find out more about it at readtoleadpodcast.com/notebook. That's readtoleadpodcast.com/notebook. You want to know how to better collect and capture your notes, what to write, how much, what tool to use and when. Maybe you want to know how to better connect and organize your notes so that you can easily and effectively and sometimes serendipitously find them later when it matters. Maybe you want to get better at crystallizing, developing, and distilling your notes so that your unique response to the inputs, your own ideas and insights generated from the content you consume, doesn't fall through the cracks. Or maybe you want to better create from and out of your notes. After all, what's the point of consuming all the content that you do in the first place if you never share what you've learned with the world, whether that's online, at work, or even in conversation? Well, you can learn all those things and more as a student of Note-Making Mastery, and that's just the start. Alumni of Note-Making Mastery report experiencing increased efficiency with their time, being able to capture and organize ideas and notes the first time through a book or other material. They report improved listening skills, leaps in their professional growth and development, more consistency in publishing content, enhanced reading comprehension and retention, becoming better conversationalists, and even starting or completing their first book. With Note-Making Mastery, you get 5 self-paced 60 to 75-minute training sessions with Q&A delivered by me, a proven process for better collecting, connecting, crystallizing, and creating with your daily notes, a complete roadmap for building your own personal knowledge management system, lifetime access to all the session recordings so you don't miss a thing, plus 2 bonuses. Bonus number 1 is a personalized autographed copy of my book, Read to Lead, if you're one of the first 10 people to sign up, and a free 30-minute one-on-one coaching session with me, again, for the first 10 people only. Where do you go? You go to readtoleadpodcast.com/notebook to get Note-Making Mastery for 73% off this week only. It ends Friday night, midnight Pacific time. readtoleadpodcast.com/notebook for 73% off the self-paced version of my flagship course, Note-Making Mastery. One more time, that's readtoleadpodcast.com/notebook. Roland lives in Brighton. He studied at Manchester University and works in book and notebook publishing. He's written books on bicycles and bread, has kept a diary for decades, and enjoys stationery probably a little bit too much. Well, Roland, I am delighted to finally do this. I've been waiting to do this for a year since your book came out. I found that it wasn't going to be available in the States for a while yet. It's here early. Originally, that day was going to be the day this conversation is being released, but it's actually been out for a month or two. And I am excited about that because I want so desperately to let my listeners know that this book is out there. So thank you for being here and thank you for writing it.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's a real pleasure to finally be speaking.
You might not know this, but a few years ago, I published a course, and it's been my most popular course to date, called Note Making Mastery. My framework is collect, connect, crystallize, and create. It's all about making sure that all these things we're consuming, all these ideas that come into our head have some place to live and have a chance to commingle and serendipitously, crash into one another and that sort of thing. And so, a couple of years into that, and I see, okay, now there's a book about the history of thinking on paper, the Notebook. I mean, how cool is this? How does one come to write a book like this? Like, what in your background led you down this path?
I guess there are two strands to that answer, to the answer to this one. It's a good question. The personal one is that I was very interested in notebooks or note taking from a personal point of view because at some point in my mid-20s, I came into some diaries that had belonged to my grandfather, who died when I was very young. I never knew him. And I got quite into just reading about these 3 years of his life. He seemed to have been a really nice, interesting, gregarious character who, I like to think we'd have got on. And then sort of inspired by that and by the way that he had sort of very much come to life in my mind, I started keeping my own diary. And then as happens, I think, with quite a lot of diary keepers, I just got more and more involved in the diary that I was writing for myself. So there's that. And then on the other side of things, I was working at a book publishers or various book publishers. And after a while, always on the nonfiction side, I love nonfiction and always looking for ideas about, which would make for good books. And the stock response to anything interesting that you see or observe or notice or hear about is there a book in that?
Right.
At some point, if I met you on a train or in a cafe somewhere and you were telling me about your note-taking method, I'd be like, is there a book in that? Just as an automatic reflex. And then one day, I guess, and I couldn't tell you when, but I must have noticed the notebook and realized that it was a thing that it wasn't like air or water always around us, but at some point it had been invented and that it was a machine. It's a technology. And the second I started thinking about it like that, as a kind of technology which has different applications, there's a book in that. Definitely there's a book in that. So I went away, discovered that there wasn't one already, decided that I was going to write that book, and then spent the next 5 years bitterly regretting it.
It's a tough process, isn't it? Yes.
It really was, yeah.
And you bring up a good point with regard to this idea that we often forget that this thing didn't always exist. There was a time before the Notebook. In what ways would you say the constraints of early materials like wax tablets, for example, shape the kinds of records people kept compared to later, more permanent materials?
Permanent is a really useful word in that context because the ancients, the ancient Romans and the people who came before them, the ancient Greeks and then the civilizations who we don't even know what they were, mostly either used papyrus, which they got from papyrus from Egypt, or they used wax tablets. And both of these are great mediums for taking notes. Papyrus, you can write long books on it. You can do really long text. You can make scrolls. You can put pictures on it. Its problem is that it falls apart. In any other environment than a completely dry, still air Egyptian tomb in the middle of a hot desert, it falls apart. It doesn't like any kind of damp or anything like that or handling. So that's a major disadvantage, and it's impermanent. Wax tablets were much tougher in one sense because they were made out of wood. And, if you had a wax tablet, you would have it probably for years and you'd always be using it, wiping it clean. But it was because you were wiping clean what was on it, what was written in the wax. Permanence becomes a problem there. So the ancient Romans, when they want to do things like contracts, where you need a permanent written record, had all kinds of ingenious methods of writing on wax tablets and then sealing them for posterity. They would wrap string around them and then seal the string with more wax. And then in order to show what was in it, they'd have to have a copy of the contract attached to the outside. So it all becomes a bit reflexive and complicated. And until paper comes along, there isn't really a good solution for writing things really permanently and also portably. So paper is a real game changer, yeah.
And fast forward a few hundred years, and sketchbooks come into play in the lives of Renaissance artists. How did they impact, would you say, the creative process during that period?
Well, that's unintended consequences, I think. People were making notebooks and not intending them to be used by artists at all. They were making notebooks largely for business purposes, business ledgers, but also little notebooks for keeping your expenses in or for jotting down random thoughts as you were going around your day. Then the artists pick them up, appropriate them, start using them for something different, and then really interesting things start to happen. So obviously the sort of the king of this is Leonardo, who's an obsessive note taker, and he writes about it that, you know, he recommends to any budding artist, don't go anywhere without a sketchbook tied to your belt with a string. Yeah, so that's clearly what he did. He walked around everywhere with a notebook bashing around off his belt. But it pays off, and it pays off in quite surprising, I think, unpredictable ways, because once you do start, as you say, putting your ideas down on the page, crystallizing them, then you can start to be really creative. You can play with them. And that's what Leonardo's always doing with his sketchbooks, for instance. You can see him playing with shapes and forms that he sees, but you also see him playing with ideas and with words, and even geometry. You know, he's obsessed with squares and triangles and spheres and dodecahedrons and such like. So there's a playfulness which you get, which I think is really important, particularly for visual artists of that period, because they're in such an inventive spell. But really, it applies to anyone using a notebook in any way, I think.
I spent 6 years spread out over a 9-year period getting a Bachelor of Science degree in business. And one of the reasons it took that long is because I started out as a music education major. I was fascinated to learn about the notebook's role in the cultural transmission of music. Talk a bit about the notebook's role in sharing music and fostering continuity in music traditions.
I love this. This is one of these areas when I started researching it, it became fascinating to me because it's something you don't know about at all. And I don't know when you're studying music education, how much they teach you about the history of music education, but certainly I knew nothing. So what I found fascinating was composed music, if you like, formal music at this point is a church business. Yeah. So it's sung by monks and nuns. And before you get paper notebooks, it takes about 10 years to train a chorister because everything has to be learned off by heart. And just the sheer amount of repetition it takes to learn all of the psalms, all of the different plain songs, and all of the different tunes and harmonies that they're going to have to master to have the basic repertoire, that took like 9 or 10 years. When they have notebooks and they can write it down, they invent musical notation of different kinds. Suddenly it comes down, I think, to 3. You know, immediately the time taken to get good at singing contracts dramatically. And this, I think, is a wonderful process. So, you know, like the artists, these choristers were obviously all walking around with little notebooks which had tunes in them and phrases, and the Guidonian hand, which is a way of learning how to transpose keys on the fly, that sort of thing. And they would have got very good harmonically as well. So what you also see at this point is different harmonies come into music. I love it that the third comes up at this point. So if you're playing if you're playing in C, for instance, they'd had C and G, which is a nice simple harmony for a long time. And then around this point, they start introducing E, and it's amazing. And they really start playing with it. And it's because they can write a more complicated chord down. And then it becomes much simpler to write music that plays with it. And then the particular example notebook that I found had clearly been used by literally generations, more than 100 years worth of monks who were singing probably in Bologna or the region of Bologna. And they had all kinds of music written down in it and all kinds of tips and tricks and scales and things like that and thirds. And because they kept it for so long, more than 100 years, you can actually see music itself evolving over the period. So, yeah, I mean, really remarkable document. Yeah, and a lovely little thing.
Many of us today use our notebooks, whether they be a digital version or a physical notebook, obviously to record our ideas, but also for managing tasks, organizing our thoughts and ideas, productivity. And there's a chapter that sort of lays out the frustrations and challenges of two Italian notebook keepers in particular. What did the frustrations recorded in these notebooks tell us about that early struggle to manage tasks and personal productivity?
So you're talking about two quite big names there.
Yeah.
Two guys with really different outputs. So the first is Leonardo da Vinci. And he doesn't struggle with putting anything down on the page, that's for sure, because he fills tens of thousands of pages probably of notebook and sketchbook over the course of his life. And as we know, it has amazing intellectual fruitfulness on the page. He's, in one sense, intensely intellectually organized. And actually his notebooks, they look chaotic, but they are actually quite organized. For instance, he never writes about two different topics on the same page. When he has a page about the structure of a bird's wing, for instance, that's all it's about. So in that sense, they're quite organized, although they look like a bit of a mess sometimes because he wrote backwards and he had terrible handwriting and he mixes up diagrams and doodles as well. But he doesn't finish anything. So he's a terrible task manager in the sense, I guess these days he'd be in danger of being diagnosed with ADHD because he plunges down rabbit holes the entire time and he never finishes anything. And it's very much part of his process to not finish anything. So the Mona Lisa he's working on for 20 years and he's still working on it when he dies. But the poor woman never gets her portrait. And that's just one of several things that he never finishes. On the other hand, he spends a good deal of time, a number of years, with Luca Pacioli, who's completely the opposite. Luca, so far as we know, never has an original idea in his life. All he does is collect other people's ideas, organize them, and either teach them. He's a very distinguished maths teacher of Italian nobles, but he's also one of the very first published authors on maths, and he publishes a 600-page epic book in Venice in the very early days of printing and book publishing called the Summa, which is basically the sum of all arithmetic, maths, geometry, algebra that anyone knows. And none of it is his own ideas. He's just collected it from different sources on his travels around Italy, but he's organized it. And he's made it palatable and he's turned it into a book and he's found someone to print it. And he's done all of these things, which Leonardo couldn't bring himself to do. So task management, he could really do. And he ends up with one of the era's best-selling books, actually. So, and is an amazingly influential mathematician and also hugely influential in the history of business and economics, because it's from Pacioli's account of double-entry bookkeeping that the rest of the world outside of Italy learns of double-entry bookkeeping and accountancy and how to run a company and a limited liability partnership and futures exchanges and things like that. So he's to blame or to credit for capitalism as we know it very much. And we don't actually have his working notebooks, which is a real shame. But I bet you they would be full of items which had been neatly crossed off, unlike Leonardo, because he never crossed off a thing. He was always looking at the next, his mind would just fly away to whatever he saw that was pretty and exciting.
I heard your conversation with Ryan Holiday about the book. And Ryan is someone I know who's a huge fan of commonplace books, having sort of been taught that by, I think it was Robert Greene, if memory serves. So around the 1500s, I think it is, commonplace books come into being. How did commonplace books shape personal learning and intellectual engagement, would you say, during this Renaissance period and then beyond? They're in fairly common use today, even.
I don't throw this around lightly. I would say it was a complete revolution. It happened very quickly and it had really, really dramatic, unexpected effects. And it's very much a response, I think, to the arrival of print. So commonplace books, the idea for them comes around thanks to Erasmus, the Dutch thinker. Now, he was another best-selling author and he was a big educationalist, and he became very, very famous. But for basically up to his 40th year, probably, he wasn't at all famous. He had lots of time when he was basically teaching for money to make his living, and talking to educationists, people like John Colet in England, who were setting up schools or interested in setting up schools. And he comes up with the Commonplace book as a way to organize all of the knowledge which has suddenly become available thanks to the explosion of books, the printed book. This is the first time in Europe when a well-educated person can't read it all. Up to that point, you can sort of just say, yeah, I'm going to read it all. I'll read all the classics. I'll read my Dante and my Petrarch, and I will have read it all. Completed literature, plus theology and philosophy. But then with the rediscovery of far more classics and people producing far more texts than anyone could realistically read, then you have this challenge of organizing knowledge. So the two parts of commonplacing are excerpting, that is pulling out what's important. So you're making a value judgment about something interesting that you find on the page, and then recording it, writing it down. And the process of writing it down, because you're copying everything out word by word very painstakingly and then attributing it, you have to think about every word you write. The choices that the original author has made become really apparent to you. And therefore you engage with the text much more deeply than you would if you just hear it or just read it. So commonplacing is an incredibly efficient way to digest an idea and really get your head around it. And of course, the process of excerpting, choosing which thing to take out of Ovid or Horace or whatever it is that you're reading that day, or Plato, Aristotle, that gives you great powers of discrimination. You're constantly having to say to yourself, is this important? No, but this is. And when you do it rigorously, and we got to remember these people, they were tough, their school days were really hard. When you do it rigorously over a period of years, you end up with this encyclopedia, basically, that you've written yourself with all of the ideas that you've engaged with, neatly organized under headings. And not only that, it's not only on the page, a lot of it's in your head because it's such hard work. And also you're constantly revisiting a page. Every time you come across a new quotation on a different subject, you go back to the page which has that subject and you're revisiting everything that you've done before. And so you have these generations of late Renaissance thinkers who have spent 5 or 6 years at grammar school building up this fund of knowledge, then taking it off to university and playing with it, if you like, or not even going to university. And you have thinkers like Shakespeare who can take a plot from one place, take some poetic imagery from another place, mash them together, and with a poetic form, for instance, invented by Petrarch in Italy in the 14th century from a third source, and he's turning out play after play after play, which are completely original, but are also these mashups of really interesting juxtapositions of ideas and imagery and plot lines and storylines. And so that's the Commonplace book. And that's why I think it's revolutionary, because it didn't only give us that really, really sophisticated literature, it gave us very sophisticated thinkers. And the first one really that one thinks of is Montaigne, the French essayist. He invents the essay. The essay springs out of Commonplace books, essentially. This discursive journey around a subject, which again, you can have a bit of Aristotle, you can have a bit of, Cicero, and then you can have something that your washerwoman says, so everything is juxtaposed in these essays, and they're hugely popular at the time. Absolute bestsellers across Europe, very widely translated and imitated. So the Commonplace book is a pretty key thing.
Do I remember correctly in your conversation with Ryan, he, as I mentioned earlier, uses one of these today. I think I remember you saying that you'd have trouble using a Commonplace book.
It's work.
Yeah, it's a lot
of
hard
work. Yeah. And you have to really need to do it. It's quite interesting that they do make them in school when they have to. Very few people actually keep up a serious Commonplace book into adulthood. Before them, you have these things called zibaldoni, which are personal fun notebooks when you write down stuff which is interesting. And for myself, I can relate to this. When I was a teenager and I was listening to music and like people like Bob Dylan, for instance, I'd love lyrics so much I would have to write them down in order to understand what was going on with them, to actually really get them. And that's a very, very old tradition, but that I would call fun. Commonplacing is really filing, it's filing ideas away. So it's very worthy, but it's hard work and people don't do it for pleasure.
Now, before reading your book, I was familiar with sketchbooks. I was familiar with Commonplace books. I was familiar with travel notebooks, which we'll talk about in a moment. I was not familiar with the friendship book. What does the popularity of friendship books tell us about the importance of personal relationships and community in 17th century Europe?
These are fascinating. So they pop up actually in the 16th century in Germany, where they're called Stammbucher.
Okay.
And they seem to be a Protestant thing first, and they seem to pop up around Luther and his cronies in Wittenberg. So you've got to think of this time as he again revolutionary times. I wouldn't say that
Mm.
these books themselves are revolutionary, but you have very, very intense emotions running high. Luther is Europe's greatest celebrity, love him or hate him, infamous or famous.
Mm.
He was absolutely magnetic. He attracted people from all over Europe and Germany. And when you went to Wittenberg to study under him or to hear him preach, you would go up to him with your autograph book and you'd say, Dr. Luther, please could you do me the honor of signing this, dedicating it? And he would sign his name, put a biblical verse in, tell you to be good, not, try and avoid hell, and send you on your way. But then you would go around and you'd check in with Melanchthon and all of the other famous people who were in Wittenberg at the same time, and all of the other professors. So
Mm.
they invent basically the autograph book, but then this becomes more sophisticated. And for some reason, and I honestly couldn't tell you why, no one really knows why, in Holland, 100 years later, this tradition of getting autographs off your professors has evolved into a very sophisticated social network mechanism whereby people have what they call album amicorum. So everyone has their own little album, little horizontal format book, about the size of a paperback book, but on its side. And every time you met someone new and interesting, you would present it to them quite formally and say, would you sign my friendship album? And very often, because this is the golden age of Dutch art, they would draw a picture as well. Or they might write a line of poetry. They might, again, put a biblical quotation in, but they might put any other thing in. Or they might doodle you and your boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever.
Mm.
And these would build up, so they would become really quite precious things, which were records of all of the friends you'd made, all of the casual, interesting acquaintanceships you'd struck up, but also the places you'd gone, because when you traveled, you would take this with you so that when you met people in far from home, you could commemorate your new relationship. But it was only the Dutch, some Germans, and strangely some Hungarians who did this. And everyone else thought it was utterly weird. So the English used to take the piss out of the Dutch. They would call it a dull Dutch fashion, always going around with these funny little books and wanting you to sign your name in that little book. It's a fascinating thing and a great picture of Dutch society, because it's as if Facebook or LinkedIn connections have been completely preserved by these books. They've come down to us utterly intact. So you can see who met who. We can see, for instance, Rembrandt pops up in a couple of them, but anyone who is anyone in Dutch society will pop up in lots and lots of these album amicora. And quite often they're still in the family in Holland. They've got thousands of them in libraries and in archives, but still lots of them are in the wild. People get them out at Christmas and say, oh, look at the ancient album.
I remember one of my first forays into using Amazon, the website, involved discovering something called a travel notebook that before then I had not even heard of. I didn't realize that was even something that existed. And they've been around for, I guess, since the mid 1400s or something like that. What role did travel notebooks play in shaping our or the public's perception of foreign lands and other cultures?
There seems to be an impulse to start keeping a diary when you start traveling. And it seems to be a pretty common human impulse. So if you have the opportunity, if you have the means, then people, Marco Polo famously, who travel far from home, have often started to keep diaries so that they can talk to people about their travels, I think, when they get back. So the very first travel literature is that kind of record, a day by day daily diary in effect, which has then been turned into something perhaps a bit more coherent. I think it plays a really big role in early novels, particularly sort of adventurous novels, maybe written for men to read, like Robinson Crusoe, rather than more feminine novels from the same era, which are much more about women's relationships or people having relationships, and they're written for a female audience. But the travel journal, I think, is a really, really interesting sort of genre of notebook. And it obviously hugely important for historians. But the irony is, of course, that you'll often find out more about the history of a place from people who never lived there, but who traveled there, because they're the ones who write down what everyday life was like. The people who live there every day don't feel the need to write down what their lives are like.
Right.
So you have this paradox where, for instance, in England, we have a terrific record of Bristol in about the year 1470 or something, like a really, really detailed description of one city, which is kind of unique. And it was written by someone who was there for 6 weeks and who didn't live there, but he's just really interested in it and he just wrote it all down.
In more recent history, I'm thinking, the 60s to now, journaling has grown in popularity, at least as a form of like self-care, bullet journaling, even more recently than that, 2010, helping people blend structure with personal expression. Why do you think in more recent history do these type of note-taking gotten more and more popular?
Firstly, I think there's always this sense that keeping a journal has, like any kind of habit that you get into, it's partly a fashion. You're more likely to write a diary if your friends write diaries,
right,
for instance, or if your parents write a diary, probably you're more likely to take to it. So probably it just comes and goes in waves as people collectively just do it and then collectively stop doing it. That's one thing. I think now, since the late 60s, early 70s, people objectively know, because there's a ton of research about it, that journaling is incredibly good for your mental health, particularly if you're overcoming any kind of trauma. The first big result in this field was Jamie Pennebaker's, and he was at one of the universities in Texas, and he got cohorts of students to write a diary entry in which they just talked about emotional trauma, something bad which had happened to them. And what they were trying to actually get at was the after effects of sexual assault. And the way they researched it was by getting people just to write about any trauma. It turned out that if you wrote about any trauma in your life, any kind of emotional disclosure writing, you were half as likely to go to the doctor in the following semester. It had that much of an effect on your physical health. A really extraordinary result. I think one of the most interesting results of modern times. And it's been replicated literally hundreds of times in different ways. We know that writing down anything about the bad stuff really helps you, which I think just confirms something that diary writers already knew, that it just makes you feel better. People ask me how often I keep my diary. I always say it's like having a shower. Ideally, you do it every day. If you miss a day, it's not a disaster. If you miss a couple of days, you don't feel good.
Right.
And that's very much how I feel. When I've written my diary myself, I feel lighter and clearer headed and just that fraction more well-adjusted, happier, whatever. Thank God, touch wood. My life is fairly free of serious anxiety and trauma at the moment, but writing a diary is such a good thing to do. I think there's a growing awareness of that. Certainly, if you look at someone like Ryder and the bullet journal method, he's quite consciously thinking about that. He sort of stumbles upon it accidentally when he's young, but he's now been thinking about it quite hard for 20 years. Right. So he really knows the mechanics, if you like, of how this kind of thing works. And it's always good, I think, organizing your feelings, writing down your feelings, you turn them into thoughts and you just take away some of their power over you, particularly if they're negative ones.
Do you think there's any value in writing them down? I mean, physically writing them down versus, typing them in an app on your phone? Do you find one more useful than the other?
It depends. By and large, I'm going to say yes, I do. But I think that if I'm writing, for instance, a shopping list, if it's on my phone or a notebook, it doesn't really make a difference.
Right.
I can't imagine thinking to myself, for instance, it's now very common. They recommend that you write about a traumatic event after it's happened to help you process it, to avoid PTSD. And it's a very effective method. I can't imagine if I'd been in a car crash or something and I had to deal with this trauma, thinking that I would sit down and tap it out on my phone. It wouldn't sit well with me.
Or a keyboard.
Or a keyboard, I think, is slightly better than thumbs, but probably I'd still want to do it by hand. You have that feeling of making something by hand, which I think is really important. And then somewhere in the middle, there's going to be a space where it doesn't make much difference.
There's a chapter toward the end of the book that talks about the processes of artists and how they use notebooks to brainstorm and sketch and plan. How does observing artists' notebooks shed light on the neurological and psychological aspects of creativity, would you say?
This is one of the miracles of the modern age, because for the first time in human history, we can look inside people's brains as they're doing stuff.
Mm.
And what I love is this relates as well to note taking, and I'm sure it would relate as well to emotional disclosure writing. When you watch people sketching something live on an MRI scan, their brain lights up like a Christmas tree. There's all kinds of
Mm.
parts of the brain which are being activated. So I'm not going to attempt to name the parts of the brain because every time I do this, I get them wrong. They're long Latin names.
I'm with you.
But you have the bits at the front which are to do with thinking, and
Mm.
then you have the bits in the middle which are to do with moving your hands, and then you have the bit at the bottom which is to do with your mental map and geography and locating things in space, and then you have yet another module which is to do with visualizing a 3D solid. Yeah.
Mm.
And all of these things parts of the brain get activated and they start talking to each other when you're doing this. So clearly it's a really rich experience for the brain. And I don't know if you sketch or draw recreationally. It's something I used to do, particularly interestingly, when I was going through difficult times myself. I'd often go away and sketch something, not to any high standard, but it really, really takes you out of yourself. I think your brain is so absorbed in what's going on the page, or connecting what you see with what goes on the page, that it sort of flushes the brain out. And sort of that is just fascinating to watch in action.
Well, I mentioned my course, Note Making Mastery, and one of the things I try to pass along to people who are going through that or are thinking about walking through that is how it helps you understand this idea that note taking and notebooks function as an extension of the mind. I'm a big believer in the idea that, the brain isn't for storing ideas, it's for having and generating ideas. How do notebooks, in your opinion, function as an extension of the mind? And what advantages does that external memory offer?
Oh, I honestly don't know where I would be creatively. Professionally speaking, I have a day job, which I love and which demands a certain level of organization. So there's a lot of list making, yeah, and there's a lot of reacting to cues and creating cues for other people to do things with. And that is great and satisfying, but it doesn't normally involve playing around with ideas and taking one concept which could be visual, or taking a historical event and trying to tie it to some kind of other idea, or what I'm working on at the moment, which is broadly similar book to the Notebook, in as much as it looks at a big phenomenon or a single phenomenon over a big time. Constantly trying to connect things which are happening at the same time. So this happened then. What else was going on? What was in the air? What was in the ether? And so my notebooks are full of spidergrams. I love spidergrams, but also they're full of lists and like trying to discern the plot, the causality. What's the chain of causality? What happens when that stone lands in the pond? Where do the ripples go? And I've become sorry, this is a very long answer to your good question, but I've become increasingly obsessed with organizing my notes, basically. So having gone from a very linear, very haphazard style when I was starting to write the Notebook to, by the end of it, being pretty organized with my notes, now I am horrifically organized with them. So I have a series of notebooks for every chapter. I have one notebook which is nothing except ideas for structure and plots and turning points and things like that. Schemes, and then I have another which is nothing but writing techniques, and then I have another which is just for carrying around with me for capturing random thoughts on the fly. I'm sure I've forgotten a couple, but it's my current project is probably about 10 notebooks already, and by the end of it, it's going to be about 30, I should say. So I'm a really strong believer in it, and I think it's something you can train yourself in. I think the metaphor of having an external mind or growing your mind so that it encompasses what's in these notebooks as well as what's in your head is very, very powerful. And that really, once you grasp that, it really changes the way you think. And I can see that you've sort of gone through this process. And it's something you often see with artists, actually. They sort of, even if they haven't quite rationalized it in the same way, they know that what they do really depends on this interaction with the blank page. And I think particularly as one thought I had as a writer, because you can write about writing in your notebook. Yeah. It's not like being a dancer or a painter. You can actually write about the thing that you do. And the notebook then becomes kind of a mirror. So you're bouncing ideas back at yourself and then reflecting them back again. So you can go into a sort of very recursive loop on these things, you could probably spin out. But Agatha Christie, I really like Agatha Christie because she was always asking herself questions on the page. Would it be better if the dentist died? Or would she really do that? Or what if this happens? She's always asking herself questions and writing down these questions. And I love that. That's kind of inspirational. And that is something, I think, which makes the relationship between a writer and their notebook distinct, not better, but distinct from the relationship between an artist and their sketchbook. Yeah, a very long answer, but it was an interesting question in my defense.
Well, thank you. Is it safe to assume, or at least it sounds like you're talking about in your case, physical notebooks that you're writing in by hand, correct?
Correct, yeah. And I'm trying to be really rigorous with that. I write with a word processor, and something I've really noticed is when you write by hand, when you write a paragraph by hand, as I do in my diary most days, I don't start a sentence until I know how it's going to end. In my head, I have the subject, verb, object. I might scratch out an adjective or change something a little bit on the way, but basically I know what it is I want to write. When I start typing a sentence on a word processor, forget about it. I could change the first word 13 times. Yeah?
Interesting.
So clearly there's a different discipline for me with writing by hand versus typing. And typing is loose. It's very easy to write 1,000 words for me very quickly. But then because it is easy, it's almost not as good. So whenever I've got a difficult passage, I try and write it by hand first. And, transitions, chapter beginnings, chapter endings. When I've got to sort of really do something very tight with my writing, then I'll quite often go and draft it by hand first.
I personally, and I'd love to get your take on this, have found a lot of value in digital notes apps. I use one called Obsidian, which you've probably heard of, and the ability to see new ideas, sort of, as I mentioned earlier, serendipitously crash into existing ideas through bi-directional linking and that sort of thing. And then more and more with AI becoming a part of the equation, I think of tools like Google's Notebook LM and being able to do research and load that research into the app and query just that research using artificial intelligence. As this continues to grow, it seems like organization is going to be less and less necessary, less and less important when I can just query my knowledge base specifically. Have you thought about that at all, or?
I haven't. You very generously assume that I'm much more up to speed with this tech than I actually am. I've never heard of Obsidian.
Okay.
I do. There's a few things going on. I am resistant. I'm going to be honest. I'm resistant to these things. Firstly, because I tell you why, as a writer, it would be different to work. In my desk, in my office, I have to write, for instance, sales copy quite often. And I can definitely see the value of AI in that sort of thing, or generating metadata, keywords for Amazon discovery, things like that. Definitely a place for it. But firstly, in my research, I am absolutely terrified of not getting a fact right. Right? It terrifies me that you or someone like you would come to me and say, "Oh, you say 1523 here, but it was actually 1525," and that would feel awful, to me.
Yeah.
And you know, and I know that you cannot trust AI on that stuff.
Sure.
So there's too much inaccuracy embedded in AI for me to sort of delegate off any research to it. And also there's this hallucination effect, which again is terrifying. The idea that it might come up with an Agatha Christie book that she hadn't written and that I might rely on that research is terrifying to me.
Yeah.
So there's that. Also, I regard what I do as a bit of an art and a bit of self-expression. And I don't want to take, it's not that I'm precious about my effect on you, the reader, because I just try to be an effective writer. But for me, the creative process is very satisfying. I don't want to lose that happiness, which I get from writing. So that's another thing. And the third thing is, at this point, I am kind of the notebook guy.
Right.
I have a duty to stay on brand. So much as I'm interested, I am sort of slightly interested in all these little gadgets and gizmos. And there's those remarkable tablets, for instance, which I saw them and I was really fascinated by. I also feel like I have to stay slightly loyal to my one true love.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned the remarkable. I have one of those sitting on the floor right here next to me.
Do you use it?
I do. To me, it was a combination of, I like to read physical books. And when I read physical books, I like to take notes on those books by hand. And it was that process coupled with taking my daily planner and combining those two into a single source like the Remarkable, that was sort of the tipping point for me. Instead of having a physical planner, my planner is now essentially a PDF inside the Remarkable. And I can, buy a new one each year for about $15. And that's also where my notes begin on all the books that I read. I eventually transfer those to Obsidian.
What does Obsidian do? It processes them, it sorts them, or what does it do?
Well, Obsidian is simply a place to let all that information live, much like Evernote. However, with Obsidian, and there are others that do this too, there's this opportunity for bidirectional linking. You open up the app. I was just doing this morning and had some notes on your book, the notebook, on the page, and some questions I was going to ask, etc. And over on the right, I see this list of suggestions of other notes that I already have in my system that might be relevant to the one I'm looking at right now based on what's in that note and what's I've got on the page. And I have the choice then of going through and by just clicking a button in an instant linking those two notes together. The notes I had on your book generated 52 instances within it, not 52 notes, but 52 instances within other notes that may have something, some relationship with what I was writing about your book. And so that, just that alone to me helps me in finding connections I likely would never have found on my own in the existing notes that I have. So that to me is pretty powerful.
That's actually fascinating. I'll definitely look at that. So thank you for that. And I guess in I'm going to say in your line of work, when you are having these kind of conversations all the time and having to get your head around a remarkable number of books every year, that would be invaluable. But then that's actually not that different to what I do, in terms of getting my head around a lot of books every year. So it's really interesting.
Are you familiar with the author Stephen Johnson at all?
No.
He's an American author. He's written a number of books. It escapes me. I'm trying to think of a single title he's written now. But when Google started putting what they call Notebook LM together, they reached out to Stephen, and he's been alongside their staff, an author all along the way, helping inform them about this app and how it should operate and what it should do and how it can help authors and that sort of thing. It's the app I referred to that allows you to bring as much as research from 50 different sources. It can be links to websites. It can be links to YouTube videos. It can be copy and pasted text. It can be Google Docs or Google Drive or any other number of sources into a single notebook. And then you can, using AI, using Notebook LM, query just those sources. So for an author who's bringing together sources on a single topic to write a book, I think of that tool in particular because it's been designed for creators in mind, for authors specifically, with an author at the helm kind of driving the whole thing. I'm not trying to convert you. I just throw that out there.
No, it's fascinating. It's really, really interesting to hear about this stuff. Yeah. I guess my experience also of these things is that I like lots of people, I like shiny, new, exciting things. Right. But the grind of, which goes back to sort of commonplace books being hard work, I guess.
Yeah, yeah.
The grind of doing these things, they're still work, aren't they? Even if they've got big interfaces.
Yes. There's a learning curve. Regardless. Yeah, for sure. Well, his name is Roland Allen, and the book again is called The Notebook: A History of Thinking on Paper. If you read one book this year, not just for fun, but for learning and for growth, you could do a lot worse than The Notebook. Make this the book you read this year if you read just one.
Yeah, can I repay your compliment, Jeff? I just want to say, so your listeners know, I'm very impressed by your aerials. You heard about this book, I think, practically before anyone else in the world had. And I'm sorry you've had to wait so long for this conversation, but I've really enjoyed it. And I do pay compliment to your idea harvesting equipment, whatever that is. You found it, and you tracked down a UK edition of the book before anyone else did. So I compliment you for that. And thank you very much for your kind words. I've really enjoyed this conversation.
I had no idea I was one of the first to acquire a copy of this book. That is very exciting. You can be the next when you go to readtoleadpodcast.com. I've got a link to the book there on Amazon. Also links to ways you can connect with Roland online, a quick summary of today's episode, and much more. It's readtoleadpodcast.com/553 for episode 553. Remember, too, the self-paced version of my note-making mastery course is on sale through Friday, November 15th this week. Midnight Pacific time is the cutoff to get 73% off Note-Making Mastery and get 2 great bonuses. One is a personalized and autographed copy of my book, Read to Lead, and a 30-minute coaching session with me if you're one of the first 10 people to sign up. For more on that, go to readtoleadpodcast.com/notebook. That's readtoleadpodcast.com/notebook. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Roland, the history of the notebook. I find it absolutely fascinating. That'll do it for this week. Hope to see you next time. Until then, remember, leaders read and readers lead.